Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to TSCRA's Ranching 101. Today, we are joined by Chip Kemp with the American Simmental Association and International Genetic Solutions, and he will be talking about the basic keys to weaned calf success as we go into weaning season and we start to look towards selling these weaned calves. What can you expect and how can you make your calves the most profitable? A few updates that I just want to mention to everyone. Our next Ranching 101 session will be Tuesday, October the 19th, and that will be hosted by Dr. Ron Gill, and he will be talking about selecting the right replacement female, what you need to look for from a breed side of things, a composition side of things, and how to make your operation the most profitable from a replacement female side of things, whether that's a retention of replacement females or purchase of replacement females. So hold that date, Tuesday, October 19th at 1 p.m. in your calendar. You can register online at tscra.org for that event. Also, we are back in session with our ranch gatherings. We have ranch gatherings in 6 different locations across the state. We are also offering in-person educational events in Lubbock on Thursday, October 7th. If you'd like to join us for our educational event, we'll be talking about the border crisis, export markets, brand registration, and all the updates from the cattle markets that you need to know. So if you're in the Lubbock area, you can join us Thursday, October 7th and register online at tscra.org. Before we get started and before we turn it over to Chip Kemp, we'd like to play a quick message from our sponsor, Lone Star Ag Credit. Thank you so much to Lone Star for sponsoring our event. And now a quick message from Lone Star Ag Credit.
My name is Jason Jones, and I work for Lone Star Ag Credit. Our mission is to help rural America. It's here to help the farmers, the ranchers, the part-time farmers, the guys wanting to buy recreational land. If we do our job right, we keep the rural communities running. The farmers, the ranchers we're financing, they're putting money into local grocery stores, into the tire companies. In the big picture, we're keeping everything moving for our rural communities to keep them alive.
Great. Well, again, thanks so much to Lone Star Ag Credit for the sponsorship of our Ranching 101 in 2021. And without further ado, we'll turn it over to Chip Kemp for our keynote session today. One quick comment that I do want to make. If you have questions, feel free to ask throughout the session. And those questions will be asked either throughout or at the end. We will try to tackle all of the questions and make sure they are answered today during this session. You can see at the bottom of your screen, there are 2 boxes. One says Q&A and one says chat. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to drop that in either the Q&A or chat box. Either one works, and we'll make sure that we get those answered before we end this call today. And additionally, this is being recorded and will be emailed out to everyone. So this will be uploaded to our educational YouTube account with TSCRA, and you will get this email of a recorded version. And with that, Chip, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Miss Emily. Let's see if I can get this shared appropriately real quick. Emily, Andy, does that look good on your side? Just so I'm sure. Okay, very good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you spending some time. I've got a bit of a rundown from Emily on the history of this series and the level of involvement that typically happens from the producers, and that's phenomenal and it's great. And I'm super excited to be a small part. Again, to echo what Emily said, if you have any questions, thoughts, comments, things you want to challenge me on, perfectly good with all of those things. Make sure you put those questions in there so we can have a very worthy and lively discussion. So here's what we're going to talk about. Predominantly going to focus in on the feeder calf side, but we're going to bring that back and hopefully maybe set the table a little bit for Dr. Gill's next talk as well as we get towards the end of this discussion. So I'm going to throw out an assertion, and that assertion starts with the fact that our customer, often whether they're right or wrong, still has leverage over us that we have to recognize, and we need to accept that. And so some of the real questions we have to ask ourselves is, who's your customer? And then how does that customer acknowledgement, how does that impact your calf price? Before we go into some of that, I do want to throw this out there. We're going to touch on some things that can be a little tense. Some of this stuff's a little bit tough stuff. It can hit a little close to home on occasion when we talk about genetics, or when we talk about management and how one of us may or may not do things exactly like somebody else, and some of the recognition of the bigger impact of those things. And so some of the stuff, you might raise your hair a little bit in a spot or two, and I accept that and understand that. And so the goal then is to turn around and come back to a tangible tool that can help us kind of navigate some of that hair-raising conversation. It would be easy to come on here and talk about some of the fluff stuff and ignore some of the challenging things. But to be frank, that'd be selling you short. And I'm just not interested in doing that. Your craft is far too important for me to play it safe. And so if you have those questions, or if I do raise your dander just a little bit, good, let's talk about those. And I'm guessing we'll each learn more because of that conversation. So, and before we get right back to the meat of the thing, if you learn nothing else, or if you take nothing else away from the conversation, I'm going to defer you to one of your fellow Texans, a talk that was given a few months ago at the annual Beef Improvement Federation meetings. John Locke, some of you may know, is a Texan, know of, and he gave a talk that I think is really impactful, and it's a bit of an undercurrent for any of these sort of conversations. So if you haven't the privilege, and you'll get this in an email, so you can get this link later on. If you haven't, go find this YouTube video. It will be well worth your time, maybe 40, 45 minutes, but I think it will be positive for almost anybody who chooses to listen to it. So back to our point, who's our customer? And we love to wax nostalgic and maybe even a bit poetic about the end consumer, and we should. Ultimately, they're the ones who are funding this entire enterprise with their significant purchases. And the price they're paying right now, let's just be honest, it's significant to buy your product. And so that consumer, their voice is crucial. And what do they tell us over and over they want? They want eating quality. They want to sit down, and they want the experience to be similar to the last positive experience that they had. And they want it to be at a price point that they can tolerate for them and their family. Now, that price point varies based on customer, based on where they're receiving that meal, whether it's through a grocer to take home and prepare, or at a fine steakhouse, or at a burger joint. There's differences. But these are the things that consistently filter through. But for most of us, there might be exceptions. There clearly are exceptions, and maybe some of you on this phone call are exceptions to this. But for almost all of us, that customer opinion is filtered through someone else. We don't typically have the direct access to that consumer who's driving our business decision making. So for most of us, the reality is that our consumer, our customer that influences our calf value, is an order buyer. That order buyer has directions from an ultimate customer. Maybe that's somebody who's going to put some calves out on grass. Frequently, it's a feedlot. But that person is our filter. They received direction from another layer of filter. Again, often those are coming from feedlot voices who receive their impact from a packer, and so on and so forth. But we want to be realistic. We can talk about the many layers of the business, but most of us don't touch those. Most of us are going to take our calves to the sale barn. Maybe we've even have some folks on here who have or may use in the future some of the video auction pieces. But for most of us, that group of order buyers sitting in the sale barn are the customer that's going to determine the value of our annual work. And we can only hope then that we have calves that are going to appeal to those order buyers. And ultimately, I'm going to talk less about the order buyer and talk more about the feedlots who are driving those purchases that those buyers are making. And so what we're needing to do is produce calves that appeal to those feedlot owners and those feedlot procurement specialists. And progressive feedlots typically have access to very beneficial pricing structures with packers. They need to, that's their responsibility. And so they know if they can buy cattle that fit in that space for the packers that they work with, then they personally are in a better position. And if they're in a better position, they're more likely to share some of that position in the form of dollars with you and I. So before we get into how do we actually look at our own calves, or how do we give measurables, let's talk about some of this tough stuff, some reality that we may or may not want to know. This is all pulled from a website. If you've never seen it, just Google USDA AMS LMP public grading dashboard. It's a really nifty resource. The USDA used to make this information available. It's always been available, but they've put it in a much more user-friendly format in the last few months. And so I'd encourage you to look at it if you have an interest. But what you see here is one graph that shows the 2021 harvest grading up through the beginning of September. And if you see over on the left, you see in the blue box, it says head count graded. It graded roughly 17 million head, 17 million carcasses in this time frame. And during that time, the takeaway is that we were at roughly 83% choice and prime cattle, and roughly 14% of the carcasses graded select. And there are a few percent, at least if you can do the math pretty quick, leaves about 3% might be no rolls or others. If you want to know what those things are, essentially for the most part, they're carcasses that go into some institutional work, not typically going to garner a premium. The premiums tend to be associated with choice and prime product. So nationally, we're about 83% choice and better, and about 14% select. Now let's look at that a bit on a regional basis. So if we go out west, there are certainly some pack-in plants out west. In the same period of time, we're looking at about 1.3, probably by now we're looking closer to 1.45 million head of cattle graded in the west. Most of the plants in the west, and there clearly are exceptions, but most of the plants in the west deal with quite a bit of dairy influence. There's a lot of dairy influence in California and up in Washington. There are some large packers. A couple of those packers are fairly integrated models, so they really kind of just directly impact their customers. One of the big four packers has a major plant out there, but mostly regional. In this area of 1.3 million head, you can see, you can read just like I can, those cattle out there graded somewhere just slightly above that national average. So they're looking about 85+% choice and prime, about 8% select. Eastern region, we're going in a bit upwards in terms of number of head graded, just slightly more in the east. Still, both of these are smaller players, but about 1.5 million head graded in the eastern region. Again, loads of dairy. Most of the plants in the east are in the northern tier of that region of the country. And again, if you see and you add this thing up, you can see that, again, these cattle are grading pretty good. Way up there in terms of the choice and prime. And again, about 9% select. And that's not unusual, in particular when you have a lot of dairy influence. Some of those things are to be expected. But again, that falls in line with the nationwide trend. The North Central, this is the big kid in the beef business. And this is a change that we'll talk about a little bit here in just a couple moments. But of the almost 17 million head that have been graded, almost 11 million of those are harvested in pack-in plants in this bolded region, in this north central region. Again, if you look at this, these cattle are grading about 85% and approaching 12% select. So that leaves one region, and that's what the FSIS would call region 6. That's our Texas, Oklahoma, etc. region. That's where most of us on this call are located. This is the second largest region, in terms of packer concentration and in terms of harvest numbers as a result. So roughly 3 million head have been graded. What we can see in this situation is cattle here are grading just north of 70% choice and prime. That gives us select of roughly 20, almost 27%. So if we do the math and we back up and we look at all these screens, what it tells us then is while only 3 million of the nearly 17 million head that were graded come from this region, over a third of the industry's select carcasses come from this region. That's an impact that we need to consider when it comes to putting value on feeder calves. 25 years or so ago, the hub of the decisions made in the terminal beef market was in that circle right there. That's where decisions were made. And interest of full disclosure, I used to work in that region in that time. And if you were within about 50 miles of Amarillo at any one time in the 80s and 90s, there were maybe 3 million head on feed. The decisions were made right there on value of not only the fat cattle, as we would call them more frequently back then, but also ultimately then feeder calves as well. Now with time, that has shifted. There's a myriad of reasons, and we could have a whole talk just on why that red line has moved north to where that blue line is. But now we're to a situation where the hub of the terminal beef business is somewhat north of there. Still intersects with the Ogallala Aquifer, for those of you out there and live on some of that water. But the decisions in large part have come from the greater Nebraska region that stretches out into some other areas as well. And so the infrastructure or the major decision implications have also shifted over the last couple decades. The South Central US also has, and this is beyond just Texas and Oklahoma, but Texas and Oklahoma would certainly be a microcosm, have some pretty severe pressures. Wide ranges in weather, that includes wide ranges in temperature, distinctly wide ranges in humidity from almost none to maybe as nearly as humid as you can get. As a result, there's a pretty wide swath of genetics that are utilized to try to fit the environment and appropriately work for an individual rancher or farmer to make that successful for them. Some of the genetics involved can clearly be perceived as less favorable for carcass traits. And as a result, some of those things are going to then impact some of our recognition of feeder calf value. Also, rightly in some cases, wrongly in others, but there is a bit of an industry perception from some buyers that the farther we go south on the globe, the less health management is thought of at the on-ranch or on-farm level. Again, some of this is an incorrect assumption, but we can't ignore the fact that the folks who have leverage, our customers, oftentimes perceive these things to be that way. Now, the last two, as the industry has moved farther north, what that means then is some of the feed yard capacity has slowly shifted. Clearly not all of it, but some of it has started to shift towards a little heavier north. That means moving calves gets more pricey as they have to travel farther. We have more issues relative to basis. We have more issues relative to shrink when we're traveling. So these are all pressures that we need to consider when it comes to feeder calf value and how we're going to maximize our results on sale day. It's as simple as that. And so we need to think about those things. I want to bring in some outside voices. I'm not going to give the names of these particular folks because they were kind and courageous enough to tell me some things that maybe for some folks are good and for some folks they're a little tough to hear. But these are folks that I rely on for content, people that are deeply involved in the Texas scene at one level or another. And so a recent conversation with a reasonably prominent feedlot owner who's responsible for sourcing around 8,000 head a week, I asked him just to boil it down and be really, really simple and tell me what impacts his purchases from a feeder calf standpoint. And so here are the, I think, 5 things that I'm going to list out for you. One, He just boiled it down as simple as this. Most important aspects for his particular yard, and his yard is his yard, doesn't mean it speaks for the industry at large, because clearly it doesn't. But in his yard, the most important aspects are genetics, condition, meaning how lean or green or hard or raw or fat the calves are, the health associated with those calves, and the color of those calves. He was also very clear, and plus I know the history of his yard, and he wasn't, this statement is spot on accurate. He said, we pay up for good data and quality genetics. And like every feed yard, they track those things. And if by chance you think that your genetics aren't tracked, trust me, if you're moving many calves at all, they're tracked. Or if you're prepping to grow and move more and more calves, people are going to be keeping a database on how your calves perform. Now, some are more upfront and transparent about that. Some demand different things, but they're going to know. And in some cases, they know a lot more about our calves than even we get to know. In this particular producer or this particular feedlot owner's case, he said, I just need to be honest. He said, it's my job to be honest to you, Chip. He said, black is a commodity for us. Black hide color is a commodity. He's clear. Doesn't necessarily mean they're better or worse cattle. In fact, I don't know I would agree with this statement, maybe to the level that he agrees that he stated it, but he's the man who's in this space, not me. And he made it clear in his particular yard, because it's a commodity, it means it's baked into the cake, and it just makes it easier to move some of those genetics, even though we know that that's not something we can all participate in, but we want to acknowledge the realities of the feed-to-calf space. He stated something that's very clear in the current landscape of the packing industry. He needs to be able to sell calves, whether they're calf feds or yearlings, at 15 plus. And many of us, especially when we're sitting at the coffee shop, and I'm no different. If I'm sitting around talking to family and friends, I might lament that, fat cattle don't need to be this heavy. Packers will consistently tell us the following: you worry about your job, we'll worry about ours. We know how to market these cattle effectively. And I think all the tea leaves would say calves are going to get heavier long before they start to, fat cattle are going to get heavier long before they start to get lighter again. So whether we like this or not really isn't the point. The point is, this is where the industry is at. And this particular person pointed that out. We've got to have cattle that can get to these kind of weights to perform. And he said something that is crucial, I think, for any of us in the commercial cattle sector. If this isn't something we're already aware of, we need to get that way. And that is that crossbred genetics simply add efficiency to each and every part of the system. And so these are some bold statements that this gentleman was willing to throw out at me. On the other hand, just yesterday, spent, maybe 3 hours having a meal and extended conversation with a southern producer who generates calves on an annual basis who are 50% Brahman. And I didn't know before we sit down and started talking, but he sends a number of cattle to a very high quality yard that has a different target, a different kind of calf, a different kind of customer, not too far from probably some of you over in Gonzales County. And he talked glowingly about the experience. And I think if you were to communicate with this yard and many others, they would say, yes, we tackle this issue a little different. Some of their priorities might look a little different than the producer I mentioned a moment ago. And in the interest of full disclosure, we also work with that same yard on some projects and have experienced very, very positive things as well. But recognize they're having to target some different calves and potentially different grids, and they're having to make money in a slightly different environment than maybe some of those who are trying to hit some of the very high quality premiums and hence some of the bigger dollars. Another group of folks who were very kind, so hence I won't use their names, but there are a number of Superior livestock reps who live in the state of Texas. If you're not familiar with Superior or their parent company, they're the largest mover, largest marketer of feeder calves in this country by some margin, in fact. And two of the more prominent Superior reps that live in Texas, I know them well, and I see the calves that they market on an annual basis. And they just were very clear that they can sometimes struggle to market some of the cattle from their neighbors, and hence both of them make the bulk of their marketings from cattle outside, of the southern region, cattle that are outside of Texas or Oklahoma. And so we could ask why, but I think we'll kind of get to that here in just a second. So the thing that we, myself included, need to just really boil down is, what does our customer want? And our customer, in this case, the order buyer, is a proxy for the feedlot. What's that feedlot want? And it's really not overly complicated. They want to minimize risk. They want a fair shot at profit. That's not much unlike what any business owner wants. It's what you and I want. And so how do they get that? And here's the very specifics. And so I'm not going to dwell too long on some of these specifics because they just are what they are. And some can challenge me on these, and we can talk about these a little later, but the facts are abundantly clear. And price differentiation that many people for decades have talked about. Well, I wish we had price differentiation in the marketplace, meaning better cattle are worth more and all that kind of stuff. Price differentiation is very real, and it already exists, and it's pretty clear on all of these things. So how do we meet that buyer's need to minimize risk and give them a shot at profit? They need calves that are set up for success. That means calves with good health management behind them. That means for most folks, they're going to pay up for groups for calves that are doubly vaccinated for the BRD complex. They have zero interest in horns. They have no interest in intact males. And a number of us on this phone call, I have a family member who's not too far in the past sold some intact males and got along pretty well one day. And so he thought that was okay. So he tried it again the next time, and it ate his lunch. If you're going to do that, trust me, somebody's going to take those off your hands at a discount. They're going to take them off. They're going to clean them up, and they're going to go sell them for a premium. They're going to make money on you. Also, docility. Crazy cattle just don't convert as well. And not only do they not convert as well, they rile up an entire pen. So an entire pen doesn't convert as well. And so they're gonna punish intense. We'll call intense animals are going to be punished on sale day if they can identify them. And then also, there are some concerns as we've pushed some of these cattle to these heavier and heavier weights with some congestive heart failure issues, in particular in some straight bred cattle, some straight bred British genetics in particular. And so we need to be conscious of that, as some of your order buyers are going to be very aware of these things. So we need to be thinking about how can we solve some of these things. And so some of these are management. Crossbreeding and quality genetics are crucial to maximizing these things. But most of these are just basic genetics. Also, for them, ideally, and this doesn't work for every producer, we understand that, but ideally, they would like them set up for a feed yard environment. So especially for those that might be calf feds going directly into a yard somewhere, they expect those calves to be weaned for a minimum of 30 days or more. They may want 45, they may want 60, and you may be in a position to do that, and they'll probably pay you well for them. But the scientific literature shows pretty clear that at a minimum of 30 days, you'll minimize mortality and morbidity risks upwards of 15%. That's actually very similar to the amount you change mortality and morbidity risk when you doubly vaccinate for BRD, by the way. And so, hence, that's a pretty important piece for them. Understand those calves then are going to understand just the dynamics of a bunk and the social environment inside of a group when they're in a confined situation just a little bit. They're just better set up for success. And also note that growth and carcass metrics are highly predictable things. From a genetic standpoint, we know the heritabilities of these things, of growth metrics, of ribeye area, of marbling. These things are pretty easy to predict in the grand scheme of things. And so they're going to look for some level of prediction of those. Maybe in some cases it's superficial as breed level. In some cases it's going to be asking information about sires, or maybe it's information on where you source your bulls. So those kind of things are going to be really, really important to your audience as you're selling these calves. And here's just another one of those little painful things. If you don't provide those, if I don't provide those things when I'm selling feeder calves, somebody else will. It doesn't mean that they won't buy my calves, but there are some ramifications that come along with that. So that's their job. We have to just recognize their job is to make money. And there is absolutely, despite some growing beliefs in the world, there's nothing wrong with that. And so that's their goal. But if your calves add risk to them, they may consider buying them, but they have no choice. They have no choice but to pay less to offset the risk. And so we have to be honest to ourselves. Who forced them to pay less? It was me. As the producer of calves, if I didn't do some of those things that set them up for potential profit, they had no choice but to pay me less. That's just being responsible. They have to build in enough margin. So those are some painful things, but let's get busy talking about how you and I specifically can highlight the strengths of what we're doing. But if we're going to highlight strengths, I would encourage us to also accept that, as I mentioned earlier, these feed yards, these buyers, they're tracking data. And we can't function on, well, because I said, or emotion, or hearsay. We need to know. We need data-driven tools. That's what's going to open up opportunities for us. Anything less, we're going to sell ourselves short. In other words, we can just make it more simple and put it in my hillbilly parlance. We're going to try to transform frustration to leverage. And if we have facts, we can get a little bit of leverage. We're going to talk about one very tangible and real tool called the IGS feeder profit calculator. And this tool is to help you identify a few pieces. But before I talk about that tool, most of you have probably never even heard of IGS or International Genetic Solutions. You have no reason to, and that's perfectly fine. Let me tell you briefly what it is. It's a collaboration of a whole bunch of groups, a bunch of breed associations that work collaboratively. There's also the world's largest agricultural DNA firm is involved. A number of universities have folks involved on a regular basis. And the reason that matters to you is because when we can leverage, actually now we're over 20 million head, that 19 million head is antiquated. But when we can leverage the knowledge we can glean from a multi-breed database, that means we can look at not only straight bred cattle types, we can also look at composite types. We can also get a sense of heterosis and its impact. And most importantly, we can look at the largest population in the beef business, and that's the crossbred feeder calf. And that's what most of us are trying to market. And so IGS is ultimately a tech company. And so that's where it's a tech company that gets its data from cows and livestock producers, serious seed stock producers and serious commercial producers. But just like a lot of data firms, our job is just to take a whole bunch of that so that you don't have to, and put it in simple tools that you can get to work with. For a lot of the tools we produce are multi-breed EPDs and then of course indexes. But today we're going to talk about the tool I aforementioned, the IGS feeder profit calculator. So profit calculator, very simply, highlights known sires. That means for those of you who are sourcing quality genetics, they go back to programs where they're tracking identification numbers. In some cases, those may be reg numbers. In other cases, they may be ID numbers that go through breed associations that may or may not be technically registered, but they're tracked through that association. Regardless, if you can identify known sires and you can prove some appropriate management pieces, and we'll dig into that just a little bit more, but those specifically deal with those two things we already talked about. Are they weaned for 30 days or more? And are they doubly vaccinated? When you can highlight those strengths, you can do some things. This tool can work very much breed agnostic. That's how it's built. There's no bias based on breed types. It can utilize cow herd knowledge that you have. For some of you, that will be as superficial as, I don't know, my cows are baldies. For others of us, it might be, well, I know the AI bulls or the walking bulls I've used every year for the last 12 years. Good, we can build a very thorough picture that way. So we can go at different levels. It also reflects for those of you who are committed to responsible crossbreeding and heterosis. And ultimately, then when we boil this tool down, and I show you what it looks like here in just a moment, it speaks a language that you and I can understand, but even more importantly, a language that our order buyer or our feedlot customers can understand, that we can talk together. And that's a language of dollars and cents. And that's really important that we can all be on the same page when we're communicating. The profit calculator can be used and is frequently used as a very effective marketing tool. But that's not the way I'm going to refer to it today, because its real strength is as an empowerment tool for you to learn more about your calves, your program, your cow herd, make decisions from a benchmarking standpoint from that, but then also then to share that with potential buyers. You'll see a sample of a certificate here in a second, but let me just show you real quick. There's going to be a number of things that are on there, but it really boils down to three main pieces. And one of those pieces is the relative management value. Essentially, what we're doing is we're going to compare your calves to what we view in this case as the industry average, saying that 60% of the calves are in the industry are weaned for 30 days or more and doubly vaccinated for BRD. And we're going to compare your management to those. And then our relative genetic value is we're going to compare your genetic merit, both your genetics for growth, your genetics for carcass merit and carcass metrics, and also your heterotic health, your crossbreeding component. And we're going to compare that then to the largest component within the beef business, and that's clearly right now the Angus genetic profile. And so we're going to compare your genetics to that genetic profile. And then, to be really simple, you're going to get a total relative value. And that's the number that most folks are looking at it, because it's an additive number of the management value and the genetic value. Now, I'm going to throw this out there, and immediately folks are going to go, oh, easy. It's a bit of a bait and switch. Anytime somebody tells me something doesn't take a lot of time and it doesn't cost me anything, immediately I'm going to get suspicious, and rightfully so. So I want to be clear. There's a very serious cost of feeder profit calculator. It costs quite a little bit of money. It just doesn't cost you as a producer. The serious member organizations that make up IGS, they bear this cost. It is their opportunity to make genetic awareness real within the feedlot sector and in the feeder calf sector. So there's a cost. Just you as a cow-calf operator is never going to bear that cost. And the time, it can be as short as, honestly, 20 or 30 minutes will take that's as much, maybe even a little more, than most producers will ever put in. But we can run fairly simplistic approaches and very sophisticated approaches. We can run as few as a single bull on kind of a base cow herd. Or I think to date, the largest group we've ran included 1,400 bulls. That one took a little more time, but most of these take you about 30 minutes of your life to provide us the information, and there's never a dollar transaction, never going to happen. And there's a beauty to that, by the way. Not only is it very noble for the serious folks who make up these IGS partners to fund that, but it also gives a nice component for you as a marketing tool that there's no dollars. We're an independent third party. You have no financial transaction with us at all. So it's a little easier for you to say, hey, they have no vested interest in massaging my numbers one way or the other. They just are what they are. It's also very, very quick. You turn that information into us, and it's a very simple fashion. How do you do that? And I'll kind of walk you through that here in a moment. But typically within 2 days, you'll get your certificate back, unless we have a question or two, we need a little more information. And that certificate is going to come to you in a digital format that allows you to share it with your marketers digitally or print it off and share it with people. And again, I'll let somebody else actually speak to that piece here in just a moment. But here's the information that you need to run a group through the IGS feeder profit calculator. And it might look like a lot, but the truth is, when you look at this, most of this is stuff that you're already going to deliver. Most of this is stuff that's kind of built in, even when you go to a quality regional sale facility. Certainly for those of you who might be selling through an online platform or something of that nature down the road, or even currently, these are things that are going to be expected. The only difference would be those last few bullets on the right. And somebody might ask, well, why do you need the heifer retention rate? Well, I'll tell you why. And we don't need it on everybody's certificate, by the way. But for those of you who might say, Well, I know my sires for 10 years. Well, what we're going to do is then we're going to use your sire information and your heifer retention rate, and that's going to help us build a cumulative picture of your cow herd over the last 10 years, so we have a pretty honest understanding of what sires are likely still represented in your herd and at what rate. And then, of course, we're going to look for the direct sires involved, and so that's the kind of information that you would need and you would provide for the IGS feeder profit calculator. Again, we speak in dollars and cents. This is what a certificate would look like. Actually, to be clear, there's actually 2 pages. There's a second page that lists all the genetics. I just didn't put it up here because it's not as exciting. It's just very simple, a matter of fact. But everything that you provide us, every detail, we're going to put on this certificate in one fashion or another. And that's really important because as a buyer, they have to know. Those folks who reference this tool on a regular basis, and we have a lot of buyers who use this tool, they want to know that you're being transparent. And so as a result, we need to put everything out there. And so up in the top in the left, you can see the blue spots. This is an actual real certificate. It's a couple of years old now, but it's a real certificate. So I blocked out the producer, their address. I also blocked out a little blue box under the feeder calf information. That's actually the address of the calves, because on the off chance somebody might know that address, wasn't anybody on here's business. But if you look on the left-hand side from there on, it said in this group, there are 72 head of 670 weight black polled steers. Calves weigh from 525 to 8. It said when they were born, when they were weaned. And so that person then can look really quick. The delivery date on these calves was early November. They were weaned in mid-September. They know immediately we got 45 days plus. We're good there on our weaning, right? It also provides something that is new and novel to the profit calculator. It provides a breed composition breakdown. And that's really important because cattle feeders specialize in different things. Some like genetics of one type or another. And so it's important for us to be able to give them as much as we have. And so if you see in the breed composition piece, it has a couple smaller components, but overwhelmingly, these cattle are Sim-Angus cattle. They're about 60% Simmental and about 40% Angus. That makes sense if you understand the landscape of the business at large right now. Those 2 breeds make a complement that's well represented within the business, and those 2 breeds are clearly the 2 dominant forces in the terminal sector at present. So that would make sense. Below that, then, in the treatment history, you can see on the set of calves, you can see when they were vaccinated, both times. You can see what they received. They got a booster for blackleg, all those things. But the primary thing's on the right. And on the right, you see that total relative value. So what does that say? 858. What that very specifically says is this: if you're a buyer, regardless of where you're buying, whether it's online or at a terrestrial sale barn, on that given day, compare them to the average that we described earlier, you could pay $858 more and still break even on these calves. You, as a producer, the producer of these calves, has added $8.50 to the break-even calculation. That's a big deal. Now, is this buyer likely to pay you another $8.58 100? Probably not. Might they pay you 3 or 4? That's what we see most frequently, is folks are hungry for knowledge, and they want to make money too. So if they take all the margin out and pay you the full deal, they might not choose to do that, but they might meet you part way. And that's the whole point, is by you being transparent with the certificate, you show, hey, I've added this kind of value. I can't expect you to pay me for all of that because you still need room to make money. But if we can share in that, now we're winning. And that's how this profit calculator works. I'm going to show you the guts of it real quick. I'm just going to use one bull. You can go look him up if you want. That's not the point. But it's going to be the same bull all the way through these examples. This is on the left. You have a screenshot of the guts of the software. So you can actually see some numbers here. And we're going to look at some different things. In this case, we're using this particular bull, and he's on a really nice crossbred cow herd that's made up of 25% Angus, 25% Hereford, 25% Brahman, 25% Simmental. Just kind of a traditional crossbred program that's tried some different breeds to benefit itself over time. So you've got a quality bull good crossbreeding in the cow herd. We've got 600-pound steers. That's what we're valuing here. But when we look at these things, what you see is we've done all of that, but we didn't vaccinate or wean the calves in this example. So even though we use great genetics, we got heterosis going on, what's happening is the buyer is still exposed. That buyer, even all that you've done from a genetic standpoint, is backwards $5. What this says is they need to actually pay $5.50 less 100 to give themselves an opportunity to break even on this set of calves. That's not a good situation to be in. Now, same bulls, same cows, same weight steers. This time, they've been doubly vaccinated for BRD. Not weaned, couldn't do that. I couldn't pull that off in my operation, but I could vaccinate them. And immediately, I've enhanced my value of my calves by quite a bit. Is it enough different from the normal to get them excited to pull the trigger on something? Maybe, maybe not. But we have proven that a third party says you're worth $2 more 100 than the average. All the way in, at that vaccination with the 30-day post-weaning, you've put these calves at $9 better than the average calf. That's real money. $9 over 6-weight steers. We're not at $60, but we're flirting with it in addition to each calf. That's real money to potentially go into your pocket. I'm going to do one more example here. Again, this is the guts of the machine. You can see the bull. We've changed the cow herd. This time, some of you might say, yeah, Chip, that's all well and good, but I live down in some pretty tough environment. And so I'm using tiger stripe cows, and they're 50% Brahma and 50% Hereford. And get it, that's what we have to do at times. We've got to make our environment work for us. But if we do that, we still need to put our management to the test. So again, a situation, we got 600-pound steers. We've not vaccinated and we've not weaned them. Of course, we know our cow herd's not really built for genetic prowess. That's not where we have that tiger stripe cow. So we're way back. We're over $8 back from the average calf. That's what we do to our buyer. We've added and transferred that risk to them, that mortality and morbidity and lack of genetic prowess. And so they have to pay less if they're going to break even. However, if we take that same cow, we vaccinate your calves, we bring it up to about even money with the average calf. That's a big deal when a tiger stripe cow is half the equation. Here's the same deal, all in, double vaccinated, full weaning, $6.50. We can make those cows dance and sing. We can do that. We just have to bring the management to the table. I'm going to be quiet for a second, and hopefully this works. I'm sure Emily will tell me if it doesn't. I'm going to say, don't take my word for it. Just a few minutes, listen to somebody else. This is a promotional video from one of the breed associations who's involved in the profit calculator. But listen to this producer tell their story, and I'll be quiet.
For 50 years, the Roth family has raised quality Simmental cattle in south central Kansas. But they recognize quality genetics and good grass alone aren't enough to keep their operation competitive. That's why 4 years ago, they started using the International Genetic Solutions Feeder Profit Calculator.
And that feeder profit calculator, we bring it to the sale every year. The sale barn posts it online ahead of time so order buyers can find that information. And then we hand it out to order buyers ahead of the sale as well. We don't want to sell just straight commodity cattle. We want everything to be value added. We want people to know that we've done a good job. We've done the genetic selection. We put the management into them. It shows that I've done the work and that I've produced good cattle, and I care about what I'm producing. I care about what I'm selling, even if they're not familiar with the program.
The IGS Feeder Profit Calculator is a free service for cattle producers looking to add value to their calves, regardless of breed. Cattlemen provide sire information as well as preconditioning, weaning, and health data in exchange for a total relative value that compares the profit potential of their calves to the industry at large. That value, indicated on a formal certificate, is used on sale day to inform prospective buyers about genetic and management value.
In February, when we sold the spring calves, we saw it being passed around a group of buyers over in the corner of the sale barn where the feeder cattle buyers were. So if they cared enough to have it with them, it's making a difference.
The Roths are using IGS's Feeder Profit Calculator as a third-party validation tool to identify areas for improvement. For instance, the calculator showed a need to increase carcass weight. Now the family is identifying sires with rapid early growth without excessive mature size or frame scores.
Of course, the first year we did it, we had no idea what it was going to come back, and came back pretty decent. We were $4 or $5 above average, and this year being the fourth year, we had the highest value over the base price of any year. So we've been working to improve that a little bit.
Enrollment was easy for the family. A few days after submitting necessary information, they received certificates.
You've got nothing to lose. You have no reason not to. It's completely free. It gives you more information about how your animals are producing based on a baseline average. It tells you what you can improve on, where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, direction on your genetic selection in the future. But then it's such a great marketing tool. It just pulls everything into one piece of paper. It's simple, it's easy for a buyer to read, and it tells them that you care about what you're doing and they know exactly what has gone into those animals and that you're doing a good job.
The IGS Feeder Profit Calculator is offered to all cattle producers at no cost and is available for mobile use through the App Store. Commercial producers wanting to learn more can visit internationalgeneticsolutions.com.
All right, that's enough of that, but you can see that's just real world people, not somebody just talking on a computer screen. If you have interest in that particular tool, it's really easy to find. I'll remind you of this website here in just a few minutes. If you're packing an iPhone, you can search for it. The long and the short of it, for a serious commercial producer, it's almost no time. It's no expense. It gives you something digital, so it's easy to share. It gives you, and your certificate is not shared with anybody without your permission. This is not meant to be a tool that exposes a problem or has a negative impact on your business. If it doesn't highlight what you need or want it to highlight, just don't share it. Use it more as a benchmarking or baseline awareness for your calf crop so you can make decisions down the road. In particular, as you heard from Ms. Roth in that video, gives you something to set yourself apart on sale day, but it's going to take a little work. Your local sale facility may not be terribly interested in going outside of their normal formats, so it's going to take a little time, a little work for you. And you can certainly reach out and we'll help with some of that to push them to move on that. But with time, we've seen it over and over in terrestrial sale barns, and we've certainly seen it on Superior. This is, we move many thousands on an annual basis. So it can work. But at the same time, not only is it good for you and I, that cattle feeder has more confidence and ultimately gives them a risk management tool when they're making purchasing decisions. So some of you, again, as we use that last example, yeah, but I've got a lot of Brahman genetics or some other heat tolerant genetics I got to work with. And sometimes that can put a little challenge on some feeder calf value. But let's go ahead and accept that and get busy solving it, because this tool can still provide a tremendous amount of opportunity there. We just have to be very intentional in our mating decisions when we have some unique genetic types that we're working with. The one thing we can't do is just throw it out there and hope for the best, because I can assure you that will not work in the overwhelming majority of cases. We're going to have to consider some breeding plans that allow us to really use some high octane sires. But if we're going to use high octane sires and keep daughters, we're going to have to get creative. And so do we need to focus more on terminal metrics? Maybe we need to use some tools if we're big enough that allow us to take a subset of these females and make specifically mated daughters and use different sires on the other side. We can do these things, and these tools are readily available now for anybody to get very creative. And if you'd like to think some of these things through, happy to talk with you offline. I'll have my contact information at the end and you can do that. But we just want to be honest. If you're using a cow type that is highly Brahman, if you're expecting to buy a single sire or a single AI sire that's going to meet the elite female replacement and elite feeder calves, that's a really difficult thing to do, and we need to accept that. So feeder calf value, though, is really only part of the equation, and this is where we want to plant the seed for Dr. Gill's next talk. And so, yes, we can highlight the value, and sometimes folks interpret highlighting feeder calf value, they interpret it to mean this: let's just make my calves way more. Well, the truth is that doesn't typically happen. Here's some data from Dave Lawman at OSU. And what you're seeing here is a black line that shows Angus genetic values for weaning weight. Adjusting weaning weights out of their situation, out of their system. And you can see there's no question that black line consistently goes up from 91 to 2015. And if you look at it currently, it continues, actually it's probably escalated that growth. But at the same time, the purple, the green, the yellow, the red lines, those are large commercial data sets from different parts of the country. And what they show is weaning weights are reasonably flat. Why? Because most calves, most environments are the limiting factor for weaning calf weight. So we can't do it just with calves. We got to do some of it with our calves. And so if we're going to talk cows, we also want to concede that some things have changed. I know I'm guilty of thinking about things in the same way that pretty poster on the wall of my FFA class that had all the breeds, somehow I can find myself on occasion stuck in that mindset. Well, that's probably not accurate from 30 years ago. So for example, two breeds, I'm just going to highlight a couple of different breeds. One, here'd be a picture of that Simmental. I talked about two breeds that have a lot of prowess. Simmental from 1983, I guess. That's a champion somewhere. That's impressive. Probably wouldn't fly in today's world. Here on the right, if I told you to guess who's the Simmental in this picture, you might be like, I didn't know there was one. Well, in fact, the left picture is an Angus pair. The right's a group of Sim Angus females, Simmental females. And so you can see that population has changed a lot to the extent that while the full blood genetics are still very, very important to this population, actually make up well less than 2% of the modern Simmental base. And I could do the same thing if I threw Limousin cattle up there, or if I threw Gelby cattle up there. I could do a lot of things to show you that the cattle have changed. And sometimes we get stuck in a mindset. And so if we had, I don't know, again, just using this breed, we had bad experiences with some calving issues back in 85 or 90, we might think that's the same creature when clearly it's not. Or maybe we used a Limousin bull back in that era, and those calves were, they were just alert, up-headed, and maybe arguably crazy. Facility's genetic, and that's been bred out of them. And so things have changed. You know, we want to make sure as we're making the best decisions for our outfit, that includes not only feeder calves, but cows as well. Because, to even just to prove my point, this is a picture from a website from Angus Association. You probably can't read that, so I'll blow it up like this. One of their former scientists, Stephen Miller, says that USDA has identified that Angus now has the largest cows, in addition to having the largest carcasses. Note, this isn't an observation of good or bad, it's just an observation of truth. And what does that mean? That means large carcasses are highly rewarded in today's business. That's a good thing. But growth can pose some challenges on the female side, and they also have some big cows. So that's probably a mindset transition from what some of us experienced not too many years ago. And so we want to acknowledge that things have changed. This is just a little bit of a modern look at that same marked data. And you can see that. Again, just talking about a couple of the populations that we've been talking about, that Simmental cow is now 73 pounds lighter in the marked data than a mature Angus cow. Again, these are just observation of facts. And again, don't take my word for it. When you get this sent to you, go pull up these websites at the bottom, take a look at this, judge for yourself. Again, how do these animals fit into your program? You want to think with intentionality. And so why do I talk about cows for a second? Here's the truth. Annual cow cost is a significant determinant on your profitability, much more so than differential and feeder calf value. So it's one thing to come around here and talk about, well, let's shine our feeder calves up, and we should. But if we do that at a loss of our cows, we're done. We're done. And so this data set, Neville Spears pulled this data set together. Some of you might have seen this. This is a few years old now. I think actually a couple years old when he published it. But what you see here is from a large data set in Kansas, and they looked at those who are the most profitable operations. Those are the blue bars. The lowest profitable operations were the red bars, and of course, yellow's in the middle. And now you put them on a map and you actually look at annual cow cost. Those that are the most expensive maintainers of cows or have the highest annual cow cost are also uniquely, probably not so uniquely in your mind, also the low profit producers consistently in this data set. And some might say, well, my cows don't cost me $1,390 or $1,000, $1,200. Oh, I bet more do than we can imagine. Way too often we get stuck in a mindset, well, my cows, I saw somewhere in an article that cow cost was X back in 1999 or 2005, and we get that stuck in our mind. The reality is most of us don't know what our cow costs are, and we need to determine that, because as we're sourcing genetics to make feeder calves, for most of us, those genetics are also impacting our cow herd. And this is just Dr. Spears' quote from that same grid, more or less just saying feeder calf revenue isn't enough to offset cow cost differential. So when we're making decisions to enhance our feeder calves, we need to be thinking about our daughters. We need to be thinking about crossbreeding and heterosis. And this isn't a crossbreeding talk, so I'll just throw this stuff up on the screen, and when you get it, you can go back and look at it a little bit later in the interest of time. But we need to be pondering these pieces that can set not only these feeder calves up for success, but if we're keeping daughters, how do we set my cow herd up to be a sustainable, longevity-minded operation that can keep me in business in the long term? And again, these are things that I don't want to belabor in this particular talk. I think there'll be a nice precursor to your next discussion. I encourage you to go through them. We can certainly talk about them in Q&A as much as you want. The last thing I would remind us is that if we're going to make our system dance and sing, if we're going to generate profitable calves and balance that with responsible females, straight breeding, for those of us who are commercial producers, has no place in our business. We leave straight breeding to seed stock people. That's their job to do those things. We don't need to be doing that. A lot of this stuff is difficult. Some of it's painful for us to consider potential changes. So I always ask folks to consider why. Why do you even have an appetite to consider these things? And I'll just put this up here. This just makes it real. This is my why, my two little grandsons. I want them to have a snowball's better chance of staying in the beef business with using this sort of data, this sort of technology, and these tools than they would if they didn't have those. And for those of you on here who are younger, maybe you're a 30-year-old couple who's just getting started out in the business, you're positioned better now than you've ever been to minimize the bad decision-making. It's still going to happen. Doesn't matter. There's no tools to ensure that that doesn't happen, but we can minimize the number of times that happens for you. And with that, I'm going to be quiet, and I will let Miss Emily or whomever throw some questions at me if they like.
Well, thanks so much, Chip. That was fantastic. Great presentation. We do have a few questions coming in already, so that's great. As a reminder, if you do have a question, go ahead and drop that in the chat or Q&A box below. I will start asking Chip some questions, and then as they come in, we'll continue along answering these questions and try to get most of them answered before we end our webinar today. So the first question, Chip, is if a buyer is buying many calves at an auction, how does he know if a calf is vaccinated? How does he watch for a calf that has been castrated? They run through the ring really quickly. How do they even know?
Sure, great question. And is it plausible that you can sneak some through a group? Yeah, you probably could if you were eager and had a desire to do that. A couple things that are going to make that difficult to do. One, your sale barn has a relationship with those buyers. They don't have a desire to deceive their buyers. They want them to come back and be engaged on a regular basis. So they have very little appetite for that. So your sale barn is going to try to point out those things. And they're going to try to sort out cattle that need to be sorted from one another. So they're going to highlight a number of those things. And let's say, for example, you do slip some of these through, and you might on a given sale. If it's just a one-off, if you just want to maximize yourself in a given year, let's say you throw some of those through. Or more unfortunately, Maybe a producer markets a set of calves and claims that they're vaccinated, claims that they've been weaned for a certain period of time, and they haven't. What I mentioned was these folks track data, and they track it heavily. And what's going to happen is if you're moving any size number at all, and that does not need to be a load lot for them to track you, they're going to know. And what's going to happen is you might have got them one time. You won't get them again. And so when all of a sudden, and this is the way this thing happens, last year, and these order buyers, as they're working, kind of watching each other work, and they're sitting, so now we're a year removed. So maybe you've got one over on a buyer and he bought a set of calves that really weren't what he thought they were going to be. Well, next year, the folks sitting next to him, they know he bought those calves last year. All of a sudden, he's not bidding at all. What are the other buyers going to do? They're not going to bid either. So if you try to play somebody, you might win once. You better win big because it'll be the last time probably in that sale barn.
Okay, thanks, Chip. Our next question is the IGS certificate per head, or can you do large groups? And what if your groups are both a mix of bulls and heifers? Do you get that in one certificate? How does that work?
Great. So what we're going to do on your certificate is we're going to try to sort down to like animals in a group. So even if you're selling a mixed group and say they're half and half, give or take, what we're probably going to do is provide you two different certificates for them to mark, to highlight that set of calves. So the steer calves, they're going to have, and again, I hope they're steer calves. Those steer calves are going to have certainly a more advantageous value than their heifers. And the folks that are buying them, when they get them to the yard, they're probably going to be sorted out where the females go one way and the males go another. So if we can sort those things apart, that's what we're going to do. So in fact, we don't actually run mixed certificates. We'll ask you the numbers and we'll sort them out. And if it's a single lot, we'll just give you two certificates. Now, we could do any number of head on the lot. So to the question of, is it per head? It could be. To be clear, we have folks who will send in and have a run for 5 calves. They're taking 5 calves to their local sale barn. I don't know if we've ever had anybody do 1 or 2, but the math would work out just the same. And we could. Do I suspicion a feeder calf certificate is going to move the needle on a single calf or 2? Probably not. Going back to our slide from way early in the talk about you want leverage. Well, if you're selling small groups, let's just talk about something that's another painful truth. If you're selling small groups, meaning less than load lots, you never have leverage, ever. Sorry, just let's be honest about it. That's the truth. However, that doesn't mean you can't add value, because at every sale, there's somebody who's got to put 15 or 20 head on the back of a truck. And if they're looking at 2 weights of 6 weight, or 2 groups of 6 weight calves, and one has no knowledge and one has an FBC certificate that shows that you've done the good things, which one do you think they're going to try to buy to fill out the back of that truck? Because they don't want that truck driving partially full. That doesn't work for them. And so there are still numerous examples. I could cite many, many folks who have told me they've added value by having a certificate on a small group. But we don't want to confuse ourselves and suggest we have leverage. But in terms of the number of head, we could run a certificate on 1,000 head. We could run a certificate on 1.
Okay, great. The next question is, what if you don't have a set calving season? What if your bull is with your herd all year round? What's the best way to market your calves? How do you get certificates for that? What does that look like?
Okay, so we need to ask ourselves, what is our management goal? And so if we're going to do these things, again, let's hope our step into the beef business has intentionality. And if I've got the bull running year round, I got to ask myself, why am I doing that? Now, there might be a very legitimate reason. Maybe you have an opportunity to sell locker beef locally. Maybe you have an opportunity to sell some niche stuff locally where having 1 or 2 or 3 head on occasion actually benefits you. It puts you in a better spot. Is that ever going to show itself positively at your sale barn? Probably not. Because again, you're just not giving yourself to have the opportunity to have the greatest shot at leverage. Small groups just are never going to get treated quite the same as larger groups. It's just the nature of business, whether we're selling cattle or cars. And so if you're keeping the bull in year round, my hope is that that's an intentional decision for something that's a business opportunity. If not, then the tough conversation is this: when do we start implementing a fixed breeding season? That's a much narrower window of time. And that might be a 3-month breeding season. Maybe at first you have to be practical and you have to transition over a little time. Or maybe you make some bold moves. Maybe you start by squashing it back to 6 months and then back to 3. Maybe you sell some animals, trade some animals. Maybe you make 2 breeding seasons, 2 3-month or 2-month breeding seasons. All those things are conceivable. But by doing that, now it gives us an opportunity to sell larger groups of calves at the same time that are like-minded. Because what's a feedlot want to do? They want to buy groups, they want to buy in bulk. In the same way that when you buy feed or hay, you want to buy in bulk. It's an asset that you're bringing in. You don't want to buy 4 bales of one type and then next week you have to go buy 3 bales of another type. You want to bring in as large a group as you can, as many hay bales as you can that are alike, so they're predictable. Same thing the buyer's looking for.
Okay, we've got one more question, and then if anyone else has questions, be sure to drop those in the Q&A or chat box. Otherwise, this will be our last question, unless anybody else has others. Chip, let's say you're not a large cow herd breeder, and you only have maybe 10 or 20 cows, and you're selling your calves at a sale barn. Obviously, we know large lots or large groups are better, but we just don't have that available to us right now. What's the best option? Should they combine with others? What does that look like?
That's a question. Thank you. That's a really, really prominent question in our business, because by sheer numbers, most of our producers are smaller. And even if you're not smaller, even if so for that person who might have 10 or 20 head, you might immediately think that the person who has 100 head has a distinct advantage over you. They do have an advantage, but it's probably not as prominent as you think. And here's why. Because if they have 100 calves, let's say maybe everything's great, the world treats them kind, and they've got, 94 calves to sell, or 94 weaned calves. And they decide to peel off, 20 to keep heifers. Next thing you know, they got 74 calves. Now, those calves are going to be some females, some steers. You know what the sale barn's going to do? They're going to split those. If they don't split those, the buyer's going to split those. So he's going to view them as 2 different lots. So that 74 head's not even really a load lot. And then they're going to split the weights of the steers down. Likely, there's probably more than 150, 200 pound weight range in those steers. So they're probably going to top and bottom that pin. So all of a sudden, even somebody with 100 head of cows probably isn't selling load lot size calves. So they too are actually experiencing some of the things that you're experiencing. So suggestions, a couple different. One, as I mentioned a moment ago, the profit calculator, we see this frequently for small producers. A lot of the folks who use this tool are small producers who are in the situation described. And they will tell you that they feel like they're adding value by having a third-party certificate. Again, in year 1, did they? Maybe or maybe not. But as they continue to beat the drum and work, both the auctioneer and the people in the room, they can feel like they're adding value because, again, folks are needing to fill out the back of trailers, and they'd rather fill those with quality, predictable calves than the alternative. The other thing, and the question really kind of beds this right in it, is if you have somebody who's doing similar things to you, and you can agree on some basic genetic protocols, some basic management and marketing windows, now all of a sudden both of you have an opportunity to better your plight and better your situation as you market together and market in groups. And throughout the country, there are a number of these sort of programs. Some are extension organized, some are just the producers themselves take care of this themselves. There are different ways to get it started, but that's the bold move, because if you can get you a situation with 1 or 2 or 5 other like-minded producers, and you can work through some of the hurdles that will come, and they will come. But if you can do that, all of you can win successfully long-term by marketing in a larger consortium. So it's a great question.
Well, I just want to say thanks so much, Chip, for everything, for the webinar and your time spent today. Anybody, if you have any further questions, if you have any questions for Chip or TSCRA related, please feel free to email us, education@tscra.org. Thanks so much for your time, everyone. Again, any follow-up questions, please email us, education@tscra.org, and we'll see you next month. Thanks for the time, Chip.
Thank you all very much. All good?